Good morning. My name is Lauren Reese, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Wilson Center, it's my privilege to welcome you to today's discussion on the impacts of Russia's war on global food, energy, and mineral supply chains. For those of you joining for the first time, I'll say a quick word about where you're tuning into. The Wilson Center is the living memorial to President Wilson, who was both a scholar and a policymaker. We were mandated by Congress to bridge policy, practice, and research. Our program's focus span every region of the world and today's most pressing issues. The program I direct, the Environmental Change and Security Program, is focused on connecting the intersection of environment and security issues to foreign policy and international development. For today's event, we are grateful for the co-sponsorship of our Asia, Global Europe, Latin American, Middle East, and Congressional Relations programs, our Canada, Kennan, Mexico, and Polar Institutes, and our China Environment Forum. The list of programs co-sponsoring today's event shows how the crisis in Ukraine is leaving no part of the world untouched. The immediate impact of the war on the people of Ukraine and on the country's neighbors is one that cannot be underestimated, and we're seeing it play out in devastating headlines and photographs on a daily, if not hourly basis. The war is also sending shockwaves through the systems that provide energy, food, and critical materials to the globe. But those systems are not linear, and neither are the effects of the war on those systems. That is to say, we need to look at these natural resource systems together to fully understand the cascading and compounding effects of the conflict on global supply chains, and to head off the worst outcomes, including the spread of civil strife and unrest in places stressed by high food prices and weak governance. ECSP has for nearly 3 decades sat in this unique position of analyzing and elevating the intersection of natural resources and security issues to foreign policy and international development. We recognize that natural resources are intimately connected to the human security, causes, and consequences of conflict. This recognition is important for getting a full picture of risk and where there are entry points for building peace and longer-term stability. Our hope is that today's discussion will provide some insight into these connections in the context of the war in Ukraine. So it's my privilege to introduce this really top-notch panel of speakers who are experts in their respective fields. We'll first hear from Jonathan Elkind. John is a fellow and senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. He's had a long and distinguished career in energy and environmental policy in both the public and private sectors, including as a former Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the Department of Energy. Following John, we'll move to a focus on critical minerals with Emily King. Emily is the founder of Prospector, a new search engine for the mining industry, the CEO of Global Venture Consulting, and the Chief Innovation Officer for Analog Gold. She's a geologist with considerable experience in emerging, frontier, and post-conflict markets, such as Afghanistan, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Mexico. After Emily, Bram Govert will share his insights on the impacts of the crisis in Ukraine on global food systems. Bram is the Director General of the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, CIMMYT, and widely known for his work pioneering, implementing, and inspiring transformational changes for farmers and consumers in meeting the sustainable development challenges. And finally, we'll hear from Sharon Burke, President of Ecospherics, a new research and advisory organization and a global fellow with ECSP. She has served in senior US government positions in the State Department and Pentagon, most recently as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy and an advisor to the Biden-Harris transition team. We've reserved the last 30 or so minutes of the session for Q&A with the audience, so I encourage you to submit your questions through the website. You'll see a box underneath the streaming video, and you can just go ahead and input your questions there, and we will get to as many as possible. John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Nope, you want to go ahead and unmute.
Because it's the first time I've ever used Zoom. Sorry about that. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be with you today and with the Wilson Center, although virtually. We're living in one of those times when it becomes startlingly obvious that past choices were not durable, were not sustainable, and were not stable. The key questions in regard to the energy sector, which I'll speak about in the next few minutes, are how disruptive the near term and responses to it will be, and how effective we will be at internalizing and acting upon the lessons, the implications of what occurs in the near term. I'll speak mostly about impacts and implications in Europe and the United States, This is not to ignore the very considerable human impact that is occurring first and foremost in Ukraine, nor is it to ignore the impacts that will be felt in other parts of the world, and particularly in the developing world. Looking then to the most immediate energy impacts, other than those occurring in Ukraine, the first question is whether one will see Europe continue to buy and utilize Russian oil and gas. This is a question that's not a trivial one, given the scale of resources that are involved, their centrality for the economies of European countries. In fact, one of the core questions is whether Europe has an alternative in reality to the importation and use of natural gas from Russia. The supply relationships that mostly are built around pipeline deliveries from West Siberia offer very inexpensive solutions for heating, power generation, chemicals, metals, and other critical industries. In relation to oil, the questions are equally important, though the standard belief is that there are greater degrees of freedom because other oils of similar quality could be found in the market, albeit at higher prices. It's not quite as sharp a question as one sees in natural gas, where even the ability to import incremental volumes of natural gas in the form of LNG is questionable. It has to be said that in certain aspects, the Russian energy trade relationships and implications look startlingly like business as usual today. Bloomberg News, for example, estimates Russia's daily revenues from oil and gas and coal exports to Europe at somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion per day. Moreover, Bloomberg Economics projects that energy export revenues for 2022, according to the current trend lines, would amount to $321 billion. And so very understandably, people are framing this question as whether Europe is comfortable to see a continuation of a funding relationship that could be understood as funding the war. What are the implications for Europe? Well, for starters, there is the distinct risk of recession if some of these supply relationships are changed. There's also an open question concerning the future of Europe's very ambitious climate goals, the Fit for 55 package that has been under consideration in the European Parliament since last summer will certainly be an area of heated debate. And we can talk more about this in the question and answer portion of the program today. I think it's important also to understand that the way that not only the energy relationships play out will have implications for the politics in Europe, but the opposite is also true. For example, some of the Central and Eastern European countries that have been the most reluctant to move in the same direction as some other EU partners are now playing an absolutely critical frontline role. Here, of course, Poland comes to mind very strongly. Does this mean that Poland, in the wake of the war in Ukraine, whenever one reaches that point, will be feeling that it is owed a greater degree of deference when it comes to policymaking on other matters? And what of Viktor Orban and his leadership, now extended leadership in Hungary? Does that role as a frontline state play into some of the ongoing debates within the EU about rule of law, for example? Let's turn to the United States in the remaining couple of minutes that I have. I think it is really important to understand both limitations on what it is that the United States can do in terms of helping to cushion some of the impacts that one is seeing in the energy sector arising from the war in Ukraine, but also some of the importance nonetheless. In terms of limitations, just to get those out on the table first, it's not as if the United States or policymakers in Washington can wiggle their noses and magically cause an overnight increase in the production of oil or natural gas that could be calming global markets or addressing potential shortfalls in Europe. Nonetheless, it is the case that the US oil and gas industry, I think, will play an important short-term role in stabilizing markets. The US oil and gas industry is under very considerable pressures from Wall Street to realize return on investment and to make sure that investors first and foremost are seeing dividends and buybacks and other things that help to increase short-term value. But regardless, I think that it is reasonable to foresee growth in US oil and natural gas in the next couple of years at the high end of the ranges. In excess of 1 million barrels a day is now being talked about on a regular basis. And also, the US administration can engage in other steps, such as the use of strategic reserves that we can discuss more in the question and answer if this is of interest to participants, and smart and creative diplomacy around the globe. Now, oil and gas is not a panacea for energy security, neither in the United States nor anywhere else, for reasons that we can talk about more later. And so this takes me to my final point, which is the necessity, the importance of our understanding the current shocks, the supply shock, to take to steal shamelessly from the title of today's event, and to understand it in the energy sector as a harbinger of the world in which we are going to be operating. We face the reality and the necessity of responding on an accelerated basis to climate change. We cannot do that without attention to energy security as well, because the two things end up being opposite sides of the same coin. So as we are changing our energy sector in fundamental ways, we need to make sure that we continue providing benefits and stability for our economies going forward. Sorry to run over time, Lauren, back to you.
I don't think you ran over time. I think that was perfect. Thank you very much, John. Emily, over to you.
Oftentimes with this particular crisis, I know people think about the pain at the pump, right? And that type of energy when there's a bit of there's a shock effect going on right now in the energy space, but there's maybe a ripple effect coming from the critical minerals and the mining space in particular. The way I see this particular conflict affecting our industry, mining, is really there's the initial effect of the conflict itself. There's the effect of the sanctions or potential sanctions or other actions that are being taken around the conflict. And then there's also a third order of the effects of the adjustment that the industry and the global economy is making to accommodate those effects, right? So we are a global supply chain. People use metal and minerals for a whole host of things that folks these days aren't always aware of. And the people that need those minerals and metals are going to have to get them somewhere else if they're currently getting them from Russia and Ukraine or Belarus, right? So those buyers, those supply chains are adjusting in real time. And once they start to buy from other sources or invest in other sectors, it's really hard to get them back into the supply chain and the space that they were in before. So that's just one thing that, you know, I'm seeing happen in our industry, is that readjustment and ripple effect. We're also slightly different as an industry from the energy space. Metal mines metal deposits take a lot of money and a lot of time to find. They're kind of harder to find in some ways than energy deposits, and they're more expensive and take a longer time to build before you actually start to get cash flow. So, the average gold mine in an established market used to take on average $50 million of investment to bring into production and 5 to 7 years to build, right? So when we look at the investments that were being made in Ukraine prior to this conflict, as of early 2021, the Ukrainians were projecting $10 billion of investment to come into 24 major mining projects in the country. Where do all of those investments stand right now? There's a huge impact to that, and it's going to be really hard to reattract capital into Ukraine. And there are similar impacts, of course, with investments that were made in Russia. From a production standpoint, there is an immediate feedback, including in the critical space. 20% of the world's resources of titanium are located in Ukraine. That is incredibly important for our aerospace industry and a lot of our national security industries. Boeing put out a statement as early as January 31st that this was going to have a material effect on their ability to produce airplanes and support their industry. And there's nowhere really outside of Russia and China for the US to go for titanium. Ukraine is also, they have the largest uranium deposit in Europe, which is also, something for folks to be keeping in mind as we increasingly look at nuclear energy. There are a lot of impacts of the Russian supply as well on what we're looking at, and people's willingness or interest to continue buying from Russia. A big impact I think we may want to tease out in the conversation today is, in addition to palladium and coal and platinum, Russia provides 18% of the world's potash. Potash is a mineral that's critical for fertilizer and crop growth around the world, right? Most people don't associate food with mining, but the fertilizers we get from potash deposits really feed the world. And they are also the #1 exporter of nitrogen fertilizer and #2 in phosphorus and potassium fertilizers. And Belarus is also a significant exporter. This becomes really important because if the farmers who are used to getting potash fertilizers from Russian suppliers can't get access to that fertilizer, they then can't feed their crops fertilizer at the right time, right? And that whole supply chain that Bram's going to talk about also becomes really disrupted, as well as the crops that are grown in Ukraine, right, that are also disrupted by the same supply chain effect. There are some critical minerals that folks maybe aren't thinking of as being present in Ukraine that are also really strategic, like lithium. Prior to the conflict, there were 2 lithium deposits that were up for investment on the border in the contested areas. Those tenders were down to an Australian and a Chinese company that were going to be, or at the top of that evaluation list. And of course, there's great concern with how China is positioned in this conflict. Who do we think is going to end up with those deposits, depending on the result of this conflict? There's big impact there. And all of that speaks not just to the impact of those specific investments, those specific projects, but companies' willingness and interest to go back into Ukraine. The biggest concern for mining companies when making an investment in emerging or frontier market or post-conflict, of which, as Lauren said, I've worked in many, is not actually physical security. It's the right to continue owning the asset for 10 to 20 years, right? The rule of law is incredibly important when you're making a significant investment in digging stuff up out of the ground that will take you maybe 5 to 7 to 15 years to realize any revenue or profit off of it. You have to know that you'll still own that project and who you're doing business with from a government perspective. So these are just some of the strategic points that I know in the industry we're paying attention to. The mining industry, as a private sector partner, will want to be there to help with the recovery. And I think one theme that I hear from my colleagues is we want to make sure that people understand the mining industry does good work. We mine metals and minerals that are needed for really important things around the world. We are a responsible industry, and we want to be part of the recovery as well, right? And we want to be able to provide technical input as people look to start restarting those supply chains, reconnecting partnerships and cost structures. The industry has a role to play in making sure that that's done in the right way so we can reconnect all those things faster rather than having a really long recovery period. I'm happy to answer, of course, any questions in the Q&A.
Thanks, Emily. I think, John, and you have really set up the how these industries are connected and given Bram a good foundation on which to build, tying in the food sector. So Bram, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. And I think the two speakers before me did an excellent job to show that what we are dealing with here is really a question about thinking systemic, about one event and how that is creating systemic ripple effects through what we call the food, water, energy nexus. And apart from what was already mentioned, Russia and Ukraine are responsible for 28% of the wheat exports globally. So you can imagine that given the war, and once again, I want to reiterate that, of course, there's a lot of suffering going on right now in Ukraine, and also their food obviously becomes a war-driven element. You win and lose wars by access to food. But I'm talking about the broader question here. Russia and Ukraine being responsible for 28% of the wheat exports globally, and those wheat exports go traditionally to wheat importing countries in North Africa and the Middle East, like Algeria, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Yemen, but also the Mediterranean areas like Azerbaijan and Turkey, or sub-Saharan Africa like Nigeria and Sudan, but also including Bangladesh and Pakistan. So all of a sudden, we're going to be in a situation where that wheat per se is not going to reach those areas. It's not going to be able to have the availability to feed the populations there. Apart from that immediate strong impact, we have a simple availability issue, which will drive up price, and the higher prices will per se become availability issues globally, not only in those countries that per se import the wheat from Russia and Ukraine, but it simply becomes an availability issue for related to purchasing power, especially for those that are already at the verge of poverty or food insecure. And we think then, for example, also about Central America, where buying food is a big element in the purchase power of families. Now, on top of that, as we heard, there's the fertilizer issue. If fertilizer NPK is not available as it was available, it will drive down the yields globally. And it can easily go up to 50% of yield losses in the next campaign, in the next field campaign, if we don't get that resolved. On top of that, we all obviously have an issue of fuel costs. Also, agriculture uses a lot of fuel to produce our food. So if we combine all that together, we have an availability issue, and at the same time, we have an issue of increased prices, which again will be represented through an availability issue, because it comes down to who has the power to buy. Now, how can we interpret this? The bad news is that this is just a general repetition for what can happen globally with any other interruption. Even if tomorrow the Russia-Ukraine war gets, hopefully as soon as possible, resolved and we get a peace treaty, even then, this is just an example of what's about to come. Our global systems will have these kind of interruptions driven by climate change, not only in one country, but can have it in multiple countries at the same time, which can equally represent an interruption of the global bread baskets due to all those other issues. So this really calls for a shift in our mentality from only efficiency to resilience towards our systems. And that brings us to a decision point where maybe some decisions are not necessarily under an efficiency paradigm, the right decisions, but they become the right decisions under a resilience paradigm. Now, you probably want to know what are potential solutions. And I think we can basket the solutions in three baskets. Number one, we need to spread our risk. Number two, we need to immediately install monitoring systems. And number three, we need to obviously make agriculture a more inclusive element and more shock resilient. In that sense, if we look at spreading our risk, we have an immediate action to do. We can immediately look at, can we increase production in the next planting campaign in North America, in Europe, with, of course, fertilizer efficiency. There are technologies that maybe didn't make sense right now to roll out before, but right now they make sense to roll out so that we can produce the same with less use of fertilizer. But also there are some other countries like Sudan, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Turkey, that if we are fast, we can produce more wheat in those countries, given that we have the right seed, we have the right technologies to do so. Obviously, on the medium term, we really have to look at where are we going to grow our food. And that means redesigning the entire strategical plans for many, many countries globally, African countries, but also North America, also Europe. How are we designing our supplies and production patterns in those countries? And that will take medium term, because it takes 6 months to grow our wheat. We cannot just produce it and tomorrow it is ready to go. And on the longer term, we really need to start a journey where we shift for our paradigm from an efficiency to that resilient paradigm. And that will require us thinking, how is a better world going to look like in 2100? And if we back cost that 2100 better looking world, what actions do we need to take in 2022? And this is not an impossible task. We have done this before. We have created coalitions of the willing 50, 70 years ago around similar kind of periods in human history. Right after the Second World War, we were capable as human society to come together and to create institutions like CIMID that became responsible for solving this issue at the global level to really drive innovation. And we have saved 1 billion lives. I'm convinced if we again can come together with a coalition of the willing, call it agriculture for peace, that we can bring in those innovations and really, really drive the change we need for that better world in 2100.
Thanks, Bram. That was great. Gives us a lot to think about, and questions are already rolling in. But first, let's go to Sharon.
Thank you, Lauren, and to all of our speakers. And I just wanted to say a few words about what this all looks like together, because I think what you heard from all three of these experts is, a compelling picture of the immediate problem of Russia's war, and then the secondary and tertiary problems, the global ripples that spread out that can be, very devastating as well. This is a picture of compounding risk, of interdependent sectors and interdependent risk, and also of a linked root cause. Okay, so this is the industrial global economy. It has brought many good things. Like, I realize right now we're talking about what concerns us, but even just the screens that we're on today, the technology itself, but the fact that one of us is joining from India, one from California, others from Washington, D.C. area. This mobility of information, of people, of goods, of communication, and then also the many other benefits, including health benefits, lives are longer in most places in the world. This is all a product of an industrial economy, of industrialization that's raised up humanity to a place where we couldn't even have imagined a couple hundred years ago, where almost everyone alive lived in poverty. Still too many people do, but the scale of change and of advancement is extraordinary. However, it's also created these downsides. And when we talk about the downsides, and you've heard from our three speakers, the way that these things all fit together, that, energy requires water to produce, and it's essential for the production of food. Minerals are important to technology, but also to energy and to food. You can't produce without it. Land is connected to energy, is connected to minerals, is connected to water, all on the input side. On the output side, one of the results of industrialization is climate change, which has a universal impact across all of these sectors. For minerals, for example, it's not just affecting the availability, it's affecting demand for a lot of those minerals as we talk about an energy transition in a digital age. And also biodiversity loss is another consequence of this system. And now we also are reminded that war is both an aspect, because this is a mechanized war with some truly destructive technologies, that some of which we haven't really seen used in a war like this before. This is what it looks like. These things are all linked together. And also the recovery is all linked together. We cannot recover for Ukraine and for Russia, for that matter, without the minerals, energy, and food sector recovering. And that's just there. What I'm really worried about is the ripple effects across the global economy. We're in an incredibly dangerous moment. It's dangerous in the foreground in the sense that what Russia's doing and the response from NATO has a very strong risk of escalation. And, the president of the United States just declared it a genocide, which confers legal obligations on the United States. We have this near-term risk, but also the energy problems that John outlined, the minerals problems, which are a little longer run that Emily talked about. And then for what Brahm has told you is there's a price crisis right away, and then potentially a supply crisis in a year or so. These are going to be profound shocks to the global economy if this happens. It's already in motion. Just how bad it's going to get depends on what happens with this war. So the problems are linked. The solutions are linked as well. We cannot address this energy crisis without addressing food and water and minerals, and vice versa. One of the biggest challenges there is it's not how we govern. It's not how nation states are set up to govern. We govern one issue at a time, one bureau at a time, and governing across something that's linked the way that energy and food and minerals and water are, we just aren't set up that way. So we put one solution at a time. There is some connective tissue. We have interagency working groups and agencies like the National Security Council in the United States that's supposed to be a broker across issues, but it's very difficult for us to do that. And so we tend to approach these connections amongst issues in an ad hoc way, which isn't good enough when you're talking about a crisis, but it's also not good enough when you're talking about a long-term challenge like climate change. So, the question of how we manage this and how we govern is a really present one that I hope we can talk about a little bit. But that's also, it also speaks to, when we talk about the solutions, how we invest, because there's simply not enough money in the world to address every challenge one at a time, especially. So if we can't figure out how to govern to complexity, we also won't be able to prioritize where we put our money in the solution set. So I think, again, figuring out how we manage this kind of complexity, and especially when the stakes are so high, is a really important set of questions. It's, what scientists call a wicked problem, meaning that there's no easy solution. But this is where we are. We don't have a choice. And again, it's playing out in the most dramatic way possible with the choice that Russia has made to invade its neighbor and to, de facto bring the war to every economy in the world. So there's worse to come. And the question becomes right away, how do we govern this way? I would love to get into a discussion at this point with everybody, and I particularly have a burning question for John right away, which is, John, you mentioned, if you don't mind, Lauren, if I'm going to jump right in and ask John something, you mentioned, I do think that there are a lot of commentators right now who are making this a binary choice, that you can either have energy security, which requires putting a lot more fossil fuel supply in the market right now, because what Russia's doing is, and the response to them, the sanctions, has the potential to be a really catastrophic supply crisis. So the only way you handle that is by putting more fossil fuels in the market. That means we cannot afford to have a climate change policy, and we cannot afford to put investments there. I know that I don't agree with that in the sense that if you put more fossil fuels in the market, you are putting more dollars in Vladimir Putin's pocket, no matter what. That the long-term solution has to be something else. But I'd really like to hear you talk about that, as you did mention it, but I think that there's a lot of commentary right now about how this is a stark binary choice, and I'm curious if you agree with that.
Well, look, there are certain decisions that one may make in the short run that are not the ones that one would make over a longer term. And the kind of classic example of that is the now increasing use of coal for power generation across Europe. I think one has to view that as being an inevitable exigency, a response to circumstances that nobody wished to be in, but one that one engages in with the recognition that also it doesn't take you in a good direction on climate. That's self-evident. I think it's important for us to remember the many indications that dramatize the point that I made rather quickly in passing, which is that increasing oil and gas, the kind of drill baby drill approach to this issue, does not increase our energy security. So think about just 3 events from the last 12 months in, well, I'm sorry, a little bit more than 14 months. Okay, fine. February of 2021, full-on crisis in the state of Texas, where there was a system breakdown of many different elements of power generation across the ERCOT territory, the Energy Reliability Council of Texas territory, and where basically no element of the system functioned well. But it's critical to remember that the biggest failure came from the natural gas sector, where both the supply and then the consumption of natural gas for power generation fell flat. Second example, May of 2021, the Colonial Pipeline system, which for those members of the audience who don't know this or don't remember it, it's a massive refined product, namely gasoline, diesel, and other refined petroleum products pipeline that goes from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast of the United States. It suffered a cyber attack. It had to be closed down for several days in a row because of risks to the operation of the system. And the third, in February of this year, just shortly before the start of the war in Ukraine, the US natural gas sector, both producers, transmission companies, and LNG exporters were another target of cyber attack. And this all from, obviously, from public press reporting. So oil and gas, the drill baby drill approach does not get us enduring better energy security. What does is much more efficient use of energy, diversification, so having eggs in lots of different baskets at one time, and very, very careful attention to system design in order to provide redundancy and backup options where they become necessary. So for starters, I say that in rebuttal to the notion that one can deal with all of this from the supply side. And on the other side of the coin related to climate, we do not have the luxury of failing to act on climate in a timely manner. This also plays into energy security. Where are most of the refineries and import-export facilities for oil and gas located? They are exactly in places that will be dealing with and trying to manage sea level rise. So it's not like you have the opportunity to opt out of one or the other. We need to do both.
Sharon, did you want to respond? Or
Yeah, just I mean, I think it's I think that last point is so important, John, which is sometimes when people want to say this is binary and that you either get energy security or climate security, it's first of all, it's just a false argument to begin with, because climate change is not optional. This is something that is happening and we have to deal with it. So you have to start from the premise of, okay, we're going to deal with it, we have to deal with it, and then go from there instead of pretending that we can trade off. But I also think that the investments we need to make in order to cut our greenhouse gas emissions are investments that help us mitigate our energy insecurity that comes with being part of a global oil and market and increasingly a global gas market. So I do think that there's a very strong mutual benefit there to investing in other forms of energy generation.
Yeah, if I could just jump in for a nanosecond more, I mean, to link to Emily's world, I think what you said is entirely true, Sharon. We also have to understand that there are supply security risks that will apply to the decarbonizing energy systems that we need as well, right? So we should not be simple-minded about this. We need to actually pull on our big boy and big girl pants and deal with these issues, both sides of the coin, in every aspect of our energy and climate systems.
Yeah, I think we've been asleep at the wheel on that. And I'm sure Emily can pop up on this, but we've been, as a country, the United States has been asleep at the wheel when it comes to minerals, and thinking that, for two reasons. One, that the market was going to take care of everything and we didn't need to pay any attention. But the problem is that we have two big economies, China and Russia, that are not leaving it to the market and have been very deliberately, in Russia's case, subsidizing the production cost of some of these minerals. And in China's case, that, and also production and processing, and then also making investments worldwide. But that's Emily's bailiwick. So
yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better, Sharon. I think unfortunately the US does not compete, right? I mean, if we want to make sure that we have a secure supply chain of critical minerals for the low carbon economy, national security reasons, all of these really important things that we should be paying attention to, we as a country have to figure out how we're going to compete against China and Russia, because they don't play by the same rules when it comes to private sector investment or building mines. They subsidize not just the actual investment in the resources, but infrastructure investments in many of these countries. Right. So it's really hard for emerging and frontier markets to say no when the only options they have on the table are Russia or China. If the US isn't in the game, right, then how do we expect them to choose us and work with us and be a strategic partner when it comes to developing their critical minerals? And I would say, for people who are really passionate about shifting away from the fossil fuel industry, all my oil and gas buddies maybe listening in, cover your ears. The best way to support that transition is to become a mining investor, right? I mean, if you want the more electric vehicles on the road, if you want solar power, wind power, you want all of these wonderful things, they are all made out of metal. They're all made out of a lot of metal, and all of the electricity that runs them is transferred still primarily on copper wire, right? I mean, it was actually Michael Stanley at the World Bank's got a great line that there's no such thing as electric bamboo. So for the time being, minerals are really fundamentally important for this transition, and what we know now, and also what we're going to be inventing and coming up with. Nobody was paying attention to rare earths and lithium and graphite and all these cool things. No one was really paying attention to like nickel. Nickel wasn't super exciting, 5 or 10 years ago. But it's the innovation that a lot of times is led by us here in the US, inventing new battery technology, new transportation technology, the green economy technology. We invent this technology, but we don't, control or participate in the supply industry that allows all that technology to go into production, right? So we get stuck in this position where we're coming up with the great idea, but there's no magical lithium fairy that's going to show up and just give us a whole bunch of lithium to make cool new batteries out of. And what are we going to come up with next? And where are those minerals located, right? We really have to be more strategic. And, China and Russia, they don't think in 2-year election cycles, right? They think in 10, 20, 50-year time horizons. And we're not thinking on the same competitive, I'm terrible with sports analogies. We're not playing on the same field, or we're not, I don't know what you would say about that, but if we want to win, we got to get in the game.
Yeah, but Emily, do you think that means we have to race to the bottom and
No.
be subsidize industries and let them pollute at will? And
No, in fact, I think the better and the more, this is why I'm a huge proponent. If you're passionate about mining being done responsibly, put it in your backyard where you can see it and monitor it and make sure that we're doing things to the right standards, right? I think it's a huge thing. even the countries I've been, lucky enough to work in, I mean, they want American partners. They want to work with American companies, whether it's the mining companies, the exploration companies, the technology companies. I think the best thing the US government can do is help facilitate those introductions and getting our companies out there on more of an even playing field, because people want to work with responsible partners. Nobody wants, to be beholden to Russia and China on these crazy debt constructs, right? Nobody wants that. But if that's the only option, they're going to take it. I think the best thing we can do, is take a high standard and hold it and display it by putting it in our backyard and showing that we know how to do it. We have to have internal capacity too. In America, we haven't really been mining a whole lot. So we've got to support our mining universities, our engineering schools. We have to encourage people to view this as a positive industry and something that's critical to the future we all want.
Emily, can you speak to some of so I absolutely agree on the importance of the mining sector in the renewable energy transition, and the sort of how complicated the global picture is when it comes to mining and the level of competition, and that the US has not been engaged. But mining is I think you spoke to like the sort of the amount of time and investment it takes to get going, and the fact that we're, don't have a lot of time. Mm-hmm. And that there are real concerns about some of the environmental and social and governance issues around mining, and how to build a sort of US competitive arena for mining, weighing it against some of the complicated sort of global pictures and companies coming out of other countries that don't have the same level of regulation. How do we sort of frame a productive dialogue amongst mining companies, government, NGOs, communities who are affected, right? And this is a big question, and you can just take a minute to see if there's a way to like sort of set up a dialogue that can move us forward quickly.
Yeah, no, I think those are all really important questions that the industry as a whole globally is grappling with, because we tend to talk really well to ourselves, right? We do great in our own conferences when we're talking to each other about how wonderful we are and all the strides that we're making on a lot of these topics. We don't do a great job of talking outside of our little mining industry bubble. I think, there are a few key points that you mentioned there. One is, there's a huge data set. It's one of the reasons I founded Prospector, that you can look at technical aspects of the projects. 70 to 80% of the world's mining companies are publicly listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Australian Stock Exchange. Those are the two exchanges that really dominate from a mining finance perspective. And I mention that because we actually do in the industry have a pretty high level of technical disclosure, not just about like how much gold is in this project or platinum or palladium, but how the company is raising money in order to build those mines, right? What are the environmental standards and initiatives that they are implementing to make sure that those mines are going to be safe for the environment, the local community, right? What are their governance mechanisms for making sure these things are done properly? A lot of that is disclosed by the industry, and I'm not saying we do it perfectly all the time or it's the perfect standard, but the industry does try to report on these things that would give policymakers and stakeholders a lot of information to be better educated when that conversation starts, right? We can look at the whole world and actually from a pretty, not to say what we do isn't really cool, but pretty quickly look at all of the projects of different commodities and where they are in the development pipeline and what they need in order to progress if they're a solid project and they are doing things in the right way. Right. So it'd be it'd be a constructive conversation to say, let's look at the universe of phosphate projects. Where is it coming from? Which projects are maybe not being developed because there isn't government support for required infrastructure, maybe a rail line that's not being built, or a lack of energy in order to actually process the phosphates. Those are technical conversations that I think people perceive mining to be really complicated and hard, and when you spend a lot of time with geologists and engineers, it can be, but we can also have a high level conversation where we look at projects that are solid, that are publicly traded and therefore disclosing and accountable to shareholders, and which of those projects if there was support given, could advance faster and meet these strategic goals that we're talking about. The world is not starting from zero, right? There are a lot of great projects out there that there are ways for us to interact and provide support where it's needed. Does that sort of answer your question? And ESG is a big part of that, right? Environmental, social, governance.
No, that's a great start. Thank you very much. There's been a handful of questions that have come in focused on the, you mentioned a lot of countries that you mentioned as sort of first affected by this impact on food availability are those that are already sort of fragile or conflict affected or already suffering from food insecurity. And we still have the sustainable development goals that we're trying to work towards, right? So I wonder if you could speak to how we could be making decisions now in the context of the crisis in Ukraine in ways that continue to support the sustainable development goals and these sort of frontline countries' ability to access the food that they need.
Yeah, thanks, and excellent question. And first and foremost, I think we have to remind that those food-related issues that I was discussing were exactly also one of the factors that already catalyzed the Arab Spring when we had the previous food crisis coming up, with the difference that we didn't see that one coming, or we weren't that clear about it. Here now, we cannot say we didn't know. I think we have the factors. We know that climate change was a factor also back then that affected. We know that then there was a couple of other drivers, of course, but those key same drivers, we're seeing them now. And indeed, it is already those countries that already were on the one end food insecure or already relatively unstable, but also made already a step back in the SDGs during the COVID crisis. I think we should not forget that the COVID crisis did create a serious setback on our sustainable development goals. And I think we were kind of becoming a little bit complacent, saying we will get there, and all of a sudden we saw how fragile our getting there was, because I think we were trying to get there by the same recipes that we have used before, and those recipes have given us huge progress. Let's also be very, very clear. But I think that progress that we need right now are going to require very different tactics and very different strategies to get there. Now, having that said, investing today in that and taking climate out of agriculture, but also agriculture out of climate, is absolutely the right thing to do. That's what we need. That's where we need to drive to. There's no question about that.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you explain what you mean by taking climate out of agriculture and agriculture out of climate? Thanks.
Of course, you cannot take climate out of agriculture, but what I mean is climate change out of agriculture, in the sense that agriculture is the first sector heavily infected already in many of the fragile production systems, that by drought, by additional temperature, we see it hitting relentlessly globally. We are seeing one of the severe droughts in some of the areas happening right now. But on the other hand, in the high production areas, in those countries like the US, where we have a very productive agricultural system, agriculture is also one of the drivers of climate change. It is also one of the inefficient users of some of that direct fossil fuels, but also some of that nitrogen that then goes back into the air as gases. So I think actually there's also a huge opportunity here. And it would be a mistake in that sense to say, let's turn the wheel harder and faster so that we can still crank something more out, because there's going to be that supply issue. I think then we're going to overdrive the machine, and eventually it can completely explode. So I really think we need to take a step back and really say, how can we redesign this so that at the same time we make our system more resilient? So in that sense, the climate shocks go out of agriculture, but also the other way around, that any action that we take is very consciously designed so that it is not contributing more. If anything, it's taking steps back on that contribution of agriculture to the climate change issues that we're looking at.
Can I jump in with a question for Bram? We've been talking about also the links between insecurity and war and natural resources. And certainly energy is a geopolitical forcing, I think, which is very much in evidence right now. Be great to hear John talk more about, well, I'll come back to that. I have a natural gas in Europe question for you, John. And materials and minerals also, although the timeline and the directness of that is maybe a little more, a little different. But with food, nothing will put people in the street faster than an escalation in food prices, and especially if there's a challenge to availability of food. And that kind of anger and unrest manifests in different ways in different countries. I mean, I think it's really interesting to see what's happening in Shanghai right now with the COVID lockdown and the way it's affecting food supplies. But what you were talking about with the countries that are dependent on, or certainly are importers of wheat and maize, we're there's a potential for unrest, civil unrest, and even violence or even conflict in those countries. Could you talk a little bit about those links and where we should be worried about, and what can you do? Because as you say, these systems aren't that easy to fix in the short term, right? So could you talk a little bit about where we should be worried about and what we can do?
Yeah, and to make it a bit more complicated, I think we should not forget to link that back with the migration streams. A lot of the migration is already food systems that are broken. I mean, in the broad sense of the word, sorry, of that food system. And so we know there is a direct link between if you have to spend too much money. Actually, it's not only the hunger per se, but it's also if it eats too much of your dispensable capital away to feed your family, that really triggers, and there's research on that triggers those unrest that you're talking about. Now, on a positive note, we also see, and then I go back to answering your question, we also see some other countries stepping up. We also see India saying we have wheat available, so can we export additionally, which is obviously an initial response. And why can India do it? Exactly because they have invested in their wheat supply and in local production, and used a lot of technology and innovation, and combined with traditional knowledge to get there. But if we look at those countries that we're talking about, North Africa, the Middle East, those are several of those countries are already, Sudan, for example, are trying to build back up some of that food supply. And there were decisions taken probably in the past that under an efficiency paradigm made sense to say, okay, I'm going to import the wheat because it's an easy thing to do, and it gives me that cheap availability to feed my population. But then obviously that needs to be available on the market. And it needs to be available to buy. And what we're going to potentially see is that availability is not there. So but that makes the decision to maybe produce locally some of that wheat, not necessarily only wheat, maize, some other cereal crops. Those countries can produce. But we then need to design quickly, and there's immediate things we can do, drive up some of those yields by making sure that drought resistant varieties are available, by making sure that water is available for crop production in a very efficient way, by making sure that we design the right agronomic systems in those already fragile landscapes. There are actually things that we can do right away. I mean, beyond the food supply that would come from a World Food Program, and the crisis was already there. There is actually still a possibility to do some things right now that can actually help with mitigating in those countries. And several of those countries are asking for help to make that design. But what we need is very good strategic design capacity and then tactical rollouts to do that, to react on that short-term piece, especially followed by that midterm piece that we need to start designing right now with some of those countries that could actually produce some of that food locally. And that is a decision of national and international security. That is a decision of preventing to have to invest later on in building up more security measures because of the migration streams that this can provoke, and because of rebuilding that we will have to do after some of those crises hit brutally the wall.
Thank you, Bram. John, I wonder if we can go to you. I know you focused your remarks on Europe and the US. I think it might be helpful to broaden that lens a little bit and think about some of the places, you think about sub-Saharan Africa, which already has a pretty strong energy deficit. And so they're in this position of rapid population growth, rapid demand, already energy deficient, right? And so how can we partner with countries and governments in a productive way now to help mitigate the impacts of the current crisis, but thinking towards this longer sustainable future? Oh, sorry, unmute.
I think it's important to bear in mind that the extent of the stresses that were already on energy systems even before the war, right? So through the second half of 2021, in part driven by COVID recovery and the reawakening of many different economies around the globe, we saw energy prices for most of the globe going to pretty uncomfortable levels. So that's the mood music that accompanies the answer to your question. What then layers on top of it are all of the various additional challenges that arise in this time as one wishes to mobilize more capital and technology and know-how to help countries across sub-Saharan Africa develop their energy systems, noting that those systems are one of the most foundational underpinnings of economic growth, opportunity, poverty reduction, and so forth. So we're talking about needing to manage increasing costs of capital in a period of broad macroeconomic inflation, escalating costs of inputs, in part having to do with the things that one uses to build energy systems. So this is in part a critical minerals conversation, but it's also, frankly, an aluminum and copper and semiconductors and many other critical materials that come into play at this time. Small side note, by the way, we shouldn't forget the ubiquity of semiconductors and the potential for challenge that arises in semiconductor production stemming from the shortfall in the production of neon gas and other gases that are critical for photolithography. The third piece that we need to think about is just other supply chain disruptions. Now, what should we be doing? We should be focusing on delivering the pledged increases in both public and private capital that have been the mainstay of conversations around climate finance in every conference of the parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Sorry, I don't know if it's just me, but John's sound dropped off. Is it working for you guys?
I can
Can you
hear
me? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I can
It's
hear
on
you.
my end. Okay, keep going, John.
So we need to deliver on the needed climate finance and broader energy system finance. We need to be focusing on how we mobilize capital, how we reduce the costs of it. And we, in particular, need to be remembering time and again a point that one of my colleagues, Philip Benoit, emphasizes so strongly, which is that, yes, it is critical to deliver basic access in the energy space. And that's as a matter of human decency, but we need to develop, to facilitate the development of energy for development. Namely energy that enables productive uses, productive economic growth in order to spur poverty reduction.
Can I just follow up on that and say, that takes time and money. the same way it does for what Emily's talking about and for what Brahm is talking about. What about this near-term challenge? I mean, both what Lauren is saying for the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are going to have a really hard time managing the price crisis, whether it's for, wheat or nitrogen inputs or critical minerals, but also for fuel, for energy, the price, and then also the supply disruption. And then I just gotta ask, because I know you mentioned it, but just to be like clear, crystal clear, just how screwed is Europe when it comes to natural gas? I mean, the near term, like 1 to 3 year ability to deal with a potential disruption of Russian gas, there's nothing they can do, right? I mean, what exactly? So it's not just the countries that are near the edge are really going to have a problem. And is there anything we can do? But it's not just the countries near the edge, it's Europe. Can you just talk a little bit about that too?
Thank you, Sharon, for those two very easy and simple, straightforward questions. So look, on the former, how to manage the shocks, particularly in the developing world, that will arise from incremental energy costs. I think fundamentally, we are now moving into the lane of the IMF, fiscal headroom being very limited in many developing countries, and the need for debt reform and attention to that space. There is no way that many countries are going to be able to manage their way through this short-term impact in energy markets alone. I say nothing for the moment about the food side of the equation, but it is utterly critical. There's no way to get to navigate through that without having a very fundamental macroeconomic assessment of the picture. On Europe and natural gas, the picture is not as immediately a life and death issue as the one that I just commented on. Nonetheless, there are elements of that. It is not today physically possible for Europe to replace Russian natural gas at current consumption levels with LNG, be it from Qatar or the United States or anywhere else around the globe. Europe simply lacks the regasification facilities to accept super chilled natural gas and to turn it back into the type of gas that one finds in pipes and burner tips and so forth. Now, the funny thing that I shouldn't be facetious about this, the reality of near wartime experiences, because that's what Europe is now going through, is that things that were unthinkable or impossible yesterday become much more attractive today. And so I think that one is going to see a host of unanticipated responses, short-term responses that help Europe to find its way through the next couple of years. You are right to focus on that time frame, because winter of 2022-23 will be potentially the most difficult. The winter following thereafter won't be necessarily hugely easier, but will be incrementally better. The European Commission has enunciated a new strategy aiming to reduce by year's end this year 2/3 of the demand for Russian natural gas. And again, they are living through this stress. They are living through this difficulty. I'm not going to say that that is impossible. I'm simply going to say that that is a huge stretch goal. And we need, in the United States and elsewhere around the globe, partners that want to see Europe succeed in that need to figure out how can we support their efforts. I would note that you don't see in the United States today any kind of victory garden sensibility about dealing with the stresses that are affecting Europe coming out of the war in Ukraine. You don't see people saying, I should lower my thermostat or increase as we come into the cooling season in order to help save natural gas that could be incrementally exported to Europe. That we haven't even started that conversation in this country at this stage. And I think we're going to have to start having some hard discussions both here, and certainly Europe will be having them on that side of the Atlantic.
Thank you, John. I want to move to some of the questions that have come in. The first one, I think, is thinking about the role of China and the Belt and Road Initiative and its relationship with Russian investments. And I wonder if we can just sort of go down the line, and if you have a comment on sort of the China element of this discussion, the relationship with Russia, the Belt and Road Initiative, and what the current crisis and U.S. response might mean for that. Emily, you look ready.
Yeah, put me in, coach. No, because we see this in the industry every day, like the direct competition on the mining investment and development side with the One Belt, One Road initiative. Saw it up close and personal working in Afghanistan in particular. And I think, on the one hand, I don't knock the Chinese. It's a great strategy and it's working really well, right? Like it is doing exactly what they want, which is one road headed straight into China with everything they want, right? So they've been incredibly effective with their strategy, and they've been really good at implementing it globally. I think the tie-in with Russia also becomes, when your enemies is a strong word, right? But when your opposition starts to gang up against you, right? This is a great vehicle that they are using to counteract direct investment internationally from the West, at least in the mining sector specifically. And I think one of the challenges in the mining sector is the level of government support that's required for sizable mining projects to be built, right? So you do end up in many emerging markets in particular with the local government negotiating directly with the Chinese or Russian government, or through state-owned companies that we don't have in the US, right? We don't have state-owned companies that when they show up to compete or negotiate, the folks know that they're talking to the government, right? That's just not our reality. And I think you see that play out in a lot of ways, and it is strategic, and it's about controlling the supply chain, not just this year, but again, 10, 20, 50 years down the road. China has restricted exports of rare earth to the US before, and they will do it again. They still control 99.9% of the world's rare earth supply, and even more of the processed rare earths, that actually get turned into components that we buy. So they absolutely will play that game, and Russia will as well. That's why they set up, or is one reason why they have strategically invested in One Belt, One Road, and why they're cooperating on it, because they know that, we are consumers at this point of mineral goods. And it's hard. There's no overnight solution for that, but it does come from, there has to be an appetite, there has to be political will to make some tough decisions and some compromises, right? We can't have it all. So we do have to make some decisions as a country, or as an international community, about what right looks like, and how do we make sure that the impacts of those investments are not just felt in emerging and frontier countries, because if we refuse to have projects built in our backyard, it pushes it into somebody else's backyard in countries where maybe there is less infrastructure for environmental, social, and government support. And so you're creating a global problem when we just push everything out. And the impacts of things like One Belt, One Road are felt certainly much more directly in those markets.
And just two follow-up comments. One is, I think you've seen a distinct shift in the US government. It started during the Trump administration, to the extent that they did anything consistently and coherently. They started shifting how we're looking at our own overseas investments, and particularly when it comes to critical minerals, and how we are looking at our investments at home. The Biden administration has really accelerated that. And I think you're going to see in the coming days, the Development Finance Corporation is going to make some big announcements in this space. The president's talked about using the Defense Production Act to catalyze domestic industries. Things like, Russia has a comparative advantage in titanium because they've underwritten the industry and because they don't care what they do on the back end of it. But ARPA-E has a big investment in titanium, in new process approaches for titanium, and that's setting up a company as a result of that grant in Utah. So I think there's a shift going on within the United States and US government, where we understand that we have to look differently at our own competitiveness. So that's happening underway. I would also say that Vladimir Putin has played a weak hand really well, right? There's no question that in the Russia-China relationship, he's the junior partner. They can't even get close to being competitive with China at this point. And yet he's managed to manipulate and maneuver the Chinese into a really disadvantageous position where they are basically underwriting his atrocities. And I don't think that would have been a natural choice for them, but he's managed to manipulate the situation so that that's where they are. Again, he is not in a strong position vis-a-vis China. He needs them more than they need him. China certainly would like to have cheap access to Russian energy. No question that that's going to be an outcome of this. And same with minerals and processing. But they don't need him the way that he needs them. And it's been interesting to watch this play out. And to me, as much as we have to be concerned about the consequences of the war in the foreground, it's really what China does next and how China reacts to this war that will be the most important security outcome for the rest of this century.
Just to shed a bit of a different light on the same question, I just want to highlight that China for sure has identified, and I think that's something we need to think about, that the strategic element of food. And I think we've chosen probably to underplay that, and I think we really need to do some soul searching there. If anything shows is that neutral broker for constant innovation related to our food production, and it's actually from a strategic decision, and it's from strategic importance to make sure that flow of knowledge is available globally. So I really think we need to look critically at how we are organizing our food production, but also the needed innovations that we need now faster than ever, and how that plays into the geopolitical setup.
Hey, Bram, do you think that the United States and China can cooperate on food security even if the overall relationship is fraught?
I think absolutely that should be possible, and I think if we look at the food question, if we don't, we're probably going to get into a very, very difficult. We're going to get in a situation where nobody's going to win. It's kind of the stadium effect where you're not, where one decides he or she's not seeing well and stands up. So then everybody's going to start standing up, and in the end, we're in the same situation, just way more uncomfortable because we're all standing up instead of sitting down, and we still have the same problem that you cannot see. So, but we wasted a lot of energy and resources. So I really think a high-level dialogue on different countries where we decide that in that space it's going to be a neutral space. And we're going to discuss food security there, and especially let's say the space to do that is there. In that sense, the organization I come from, CIMIT, is absolutely apolitical, 100% neutral. We work with China, we work with the US, we work with Europe, obviously to impact Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. But I think the space is there. It is a matter of, are we ready to take that space and actually come together very strategically? Are we ready to create another historical moment where some of those decision makers from the public sector, but allow me also to call from the private sector, because there's things public sector can do and there's things private sector can do. And I think at the forefront, we need to make very, very clear what are those things that they can do. It's not the same. Public and private sector do not have the same mandate nor the same capability or capacity. Needs to go hand in hand. So I think those two players need to come together, and we need to create a historic moment where you say, yes, we need to overcome and just do it, because just simply because it is in the advantage of all that are going to be sitting around that table.
Thank you, Bram. John.
Three quick points, if I might, on this topic of the Belt and Road Initiative. First, to support a point that Emily made, that relationship between Russia and China is not simple. It's not straightforward, and there are, look, for example, at the history of the Power of Siberia pipeline, which was under negotiation for something like 10 years until finally Russia needed a win in the wake of the first invasion of Ukraine. And in a time when Russia was comparatively isolated, that's when the deal was finally consummated and terms were agreed. But those terms are really different than what Russia has gotten in its trade with Europe. The delivered price of the gas is said to be somewhere in the $4 to $4.50 per million BTU, which is somewhere close to what the typical price is at Henry Hub in the United States, whereas gas delivered into Europe is today trading at north of $30 per million BTU. Under normal circumstances, it has not been that much of a differential, but nonetheless, I say that to make the fundamental point that that's not an easy relationship. Second point about Belt and Road that I think bears our attention is the point that you can't beat something with nothing. So we may like or dislike the Belt and Road Initiative, but unless we actually provide the capability to meet the needs of developing countries, we're going into the conflict, the competition with our hands tied behind our backs. So I point out that the America Competes Act and USICA are still looking for passage in the US Congress. It's long overdue. I hope that will get taken care of, because we need the tools and we need the capital to be able to go to developing countries and address very concrete needs that otherwise decision makers in those countries will solve by going to China and to the Chinese development banks under Belt and Road. Last point, just quickly, I very much have appreciated the perspective and the wisdom that Emily has brought to this discussion. The critical minerals piece is so important, but I also think that we need to, in the spirit of candor, remember that the mining industry in the United States, it has not prospered, in part because some of the companies that were willing to cut corners made for very bad press for that industry in the United States. The environmental impacts that were very real and material that happened as a consequence of years ago operations by the mining industry in the United States create a very long hangover. And this often is the case. You see the same thing, for example, in the oil and gas industry, where past bad behavior gets translated into what one could expect going forward. That's something that the industry needs to be really, really forthright in dealing with, because we need those companies operating in the United States. We need the relationships also with other partners and allies around the globe who can, in good conscience, see that development happening in their countries as well.
If I can just address that last point, I think it's really, really important what Jonathan said. I mean, it is a very long hangover. It's a longer hangover than I'd get at a mining industry cocktail party, right? Like, which is pretty long. They're great parties. But it's one thing that our industry is grappling with daily, right? The perceptions of what we are like now as an industry are way off on a lot of factors, but it's also, company specific. Some companies are doing a great job. They're doing the hard work, right? They're trying to make up for past wrongs. They're setting realistic targets and trying to meet them. And we still have, actors in the industry that are not, right? And that is the reality. And Russia and China, by the way, are a big part of our industry, right? We are an international industry. So the actions of a Chinese firm or a Russian firm have impact on the perception of our industry as a whole. So we are certainly not done yet with fixing that issue. And I think if we can find one way, again, to help with this crisis, to show there are groups within the industry that do want to be a really constructive and responsible part of the recovery, right? I mean, it's an opportunity for us to really show up as an industry and say, here's what we can do to assist and maybe build that relationship, rebuild some of that trust, and rebuild some of the education, because there's a real lack of education about what our industry does and why it's important globally, not just in the US, but globally. So I wholeheartedly agree. And I think all we can do is look at where we are now and how we can better communicate and build that trust with local communities, governments, and all of the stakeholders, right, to make sure that we're doing better today than we were doing yesterday.
Thanks, Emily. So there's like a lot of questions that we didn't get to. And I think there's probably enough here for some follow-up events focused especially on specific regions. I think there's a lot of interest in how some of these issues are going to play out in specific country and regional contexts. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to those in today's 90-minute discussion. I want to end with sort of one sort of big question that you have all sort of spoken to a certain extent in today's discussion. But just if you want to take 1 minute to share your top line message to the folks in the US government, other governments, and private industry who are grappling with these questions, which is that what steps should they be taking now to deal with the uncertainty of the crisis and the tension between the decisions that need to be made today and those that need to be made for the long-term sustainability? What would be sort of like your top line message? So we can just go around the panel, and then I'm afraid that we'll have to wrap up. So let's see, who wants to go first? John.
Happy to. You said U.S. government. I'm going to direct that toward the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue than the one that one typically thinks of there. It is absolutely vital that the U.S. Congress make progress now on some of the issues that have been hanging for some time. Do we or do we not provide clear statutory guidance on climate? Do we or do we not provide clear statutory guidance on things like the elements of the America Competes Act? We're looking at a really troubling backdrop of war in Ukraine. Surely we can do better than what we have done in terms of finding compromise and making progress.
Thank you, John. Bram.
I think it's a plea to say let's really do something. I think we have an opportunity. We have a window of opportunity here to avoid that the worst plays out. And I think if the worst plays out, it's really going to get bad. And I don't want to send a doom message here. I really want to send a message of hope that is saying that there are instruments there. The organizations are there that could be activated very fast. There is response capacity to something immediate, which is related to producing more in different places, efficient, and give the right tools to those farmers globally that produce literally our daily bread and that need to produce it for general peace globally, but also to redesign that medium piece that we need to start designing today. Every day we lose is a lost opportunity to get there and to get it right very, very, very fast. And let's not forget at the same time the longer term perspective, because this shock is just one example of the multiple shocks to come. So we really need a strategic and tactical plan activating some of the response capacity that I think we were taking for granted and that was there for a bit dormantly taking care of what is actually crucially important. That is that everybody can eat sufficiently and get the energy they need to thrive and get their potential out. But the instruments are there. It is just a matter of activating them.
That's great, Bram. Thank you. Emily.
Yeah, I guess my one note to policymakers and decision makers would be, please let's talk and let's make sure that we're sharing all of our data with you, right? And the information of the current state, so that as you're making policy decisions, you have kind of the whole universe of data and information to make that really critical decision. You know, that's not our role in industry, but we do want to make sure that decisions are being made with a full picture of the options that are available and the impact of all of those options. And we've got a lot of it, and we would love to be invited to the table for the discussion.
Thank you, Emily. Sharon.
So, 100 years ago, we came off of a world war and a global pandemic straight into an economic crash and a global depression. Populist movements, authoritarian movements rose and took over too many countries around the world. And we headed right into a second world war that, saw unparalleled atrocities for modern times. We're in a really dangerous interwar period here. We didn't know it was interwar until really recently. With the end of the Cold War, now we have this pandemic shock. And as you've heard today, global systems, food, energy, mineral systems are at risk. And we're watching a war that's similarly already experiencing civilian atrocities and has the risk of escalation. This is an incredibly dangerous moment. And I do think that, as all of my colleagues have intimated, that the American people, our members of Congress, our administration, our allies, our partners, we all need to act like it, because it would be hard to overstate just how dangerous this moment is. We're not necessarily going to repeat history, but we're definitely on a track that's not going in a good place. But what I really liked about this discussion, and thank you, Lauren, for pulling us together, is that everybody who was part of it identified ways to avert this catastrophe, that there are solutions. Ultimately, the number one solution is that we need Russia to agree to a ceasefire and to stop its attack on its neighbor. We must find a way out. But even given that, there are ways that we can avert this system shock globally and this catastrophe, but it's going to require all of us to act like everything's on the line, because it is.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you for helping to pull us together as well, Sharon. It's very helpful to work with you on this event. John, Emily, Bram, Sharon, you guys have all been brilliant. I really appreciate you taking the time out. Bram joining us from India. Your insights are invaluable, and we'll look forward to ways to continue the conversation. Thank you for those of you tuning in. Thank you to our AV team, Trayon and Tracy, for making this possible, and to Amanda King and Claire Doyle for your support on today's event. We will post a summary of the event on newsecuritybeat.org, our blog, and the archive of the video from today's event will be available on the event page the next day or so. Please feel free to follow up with any questions that you might have, and happy to put you in touch with the speakers, assuming that they are willing to follow up individually. But there were a lot of good questions that came in that we weren't able to get to. So we'll look forward to future conversations. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.